Trump says Kyiv should put more pressure not only on Moscow but also on St. Petersburg. Frustrated with Putin, Trump gives 50 days for peace deal, and how Medvedev reacts on Trump's theatrical ultimatum. We'll talk about this with the political analyst, European Leadership Network UK member Alexandra Filippenko. Alexandra, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Alexandra, US President Donald Trump is disappointed with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin due to the lack of progress in peace negotiations regarding the war in Ukraine. Trump also noted that he had expected a peace deal with Putin 2 months ago, but it never happened. In response, Trump promised to impose tough economic measures. He said, "We are going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. It's very simple, and they will be at 100%, and that's the way it is." How many more days must Ukraine wait while people continue to die every single hour? Isn't it time to move beyond deadlines and finally act?
Well, I must say that I think, to my mind, we should not look at those 50 days apart from weapons that are going to Ukraine, weapons that are going to be supplied to Ukraine from Europe in the nearest days, as President Trump put it, these days. He didn't say exactly when, but these days the weapons are supposed to come to Ukraine from European stockpiles, while European stockpiles will get weapons from the United States in the nearest future, and Europe will pay for it. So, of course, when we see those 50 days, we can say, would this be anything like those sanctions or tariffs, for example, on European nations or on China or on Canada or on Mexico, when Trump always chickens out? Will it be taco Trump? Will it happen like that, how it happens with the tariffs? Or will it be like with Iran? Let's remind everyone that President Trump gave Iran 60 days, and we all saw what happened after those 60 days. He gave 60 days to Iran, and although he was promising some talks with Iran and the continuation of negotiations with Iran, on the 61st day, Israel launched its attacks, and then American attacks came to Iran. That's what we saw after those 60 days back then. So we are now wary. Will this be like with Iran, or will it be like with European nations or with any other countries about tariffs? Will Trump chicken out? But this is a question of sanctions, a question of tariffs, a question of tariffing some other countries that are buying Russian natural resources, or 100% sanctions on Russian goods coming to the United States, or even Russian mineral resources coming to the United States. But I believe that we should not look at it apart from the weapons that are coming to Ukraine. So, of course, we must say that we can be open. We can frankly say that, yes, it would have been amazing if President Trump just took his wonderful pen and signed sanctions right then and there with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. That would be amazing if he did that right then and there in the White House, in the Oval Office. But we didn't see it. We saw those 50 days until new sanctions on Russia. But at the same moment, what happened? He didn't sign the sanctions, but he is sending weapons. Weapons are coming to Ukraine. And it's not my quote. I've heard it from many military analysts who were saying that a war would not end with sanctions, would not end with some economic pressure on Russia. War would end on the battlefield. War would end with more defensive weapons for Ukraine and offensive weapons for Ukraine. This is how the war can end. Actually, a real end, as good of an end as we can, if we can even use this word. If there can be a fair end, there cannot be a fair end to any war. But if we can talk about a fair ending, this can happen only when Ukraine has enough defensive and offensive weapons at its disposal. And that is what President Trump is giving. We've been hearing $10 billion from Axios and a few tens of billions of dollars from different resources. So I think that even though, yes, psychologically, that would be very helpful to everyone and everyone who's listening and to everyone who is following war in Ukraine. It would be amazing if we saw those sanctions signed right then and there and didn't think about, oh, those 50 days, what would happen in those 50 days? But also, we should look at the weapons that are coming to Ukraine. And that is, I believe, an important step by the American administration. And we should look at it as a whole, not just no sanctions right now in 50 days until those sanctions, but we should look at, yes, no sanctions for 50 days. Let's remember what happened to Iran after 60 days, but also let's look at what is happening with sending weapons to Ukraine. So I think these are things that are interconnected and they happened at the same time. That's important to look at it at the same time.
We're waiting and need to say thank you so much for these weapons, and I think that everything will be good. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation and former Russian president, has responded to US President Donald Trump's ultimatum to impose tough sanctions against Russia if no peace agreement is reached within 50 days. Medvedev believes that Trump has issued a theatrical ultimatum to the Kremlin. And he said the world shuddered, awaiting the consequences. Militant Europe was disappointed. Russia was indifferent. He wrote, does this mockery by Medvedev reflect a broader belief in Moscow that the West will continue to hesitate or negotiate with itself rather than act decisively? If we are not talking about weapons right now.
If we're talking about sanctions, of course, there's no other way they could react to that, because this is, look, it's just a special military operation somewhere very far. Oh, that's happening somewhere very far from the center, let's say, very far from Moscow, very far from St. Petersburg, that Donald Trump asked about, let's say, putting more pressure on. And that's to another point. So we're talking about sanctions. Yes, this is the only way they could react. This is the only way they could react to that, because nothing happens. Everything is fine. Everything is going according to plan. Remember, they love saying that everything is going according to plan. Everything is going great. So this is the way they should react. This is the way the propaganda should react. And as we've heard from many times after any negotiations or any talks or any even phone calls between the Russian side and the American side, we could always read different points of view of, for example, Russian Foreign Ministry and the State Department. The latest example is, of course, in Malaysia, in the ASEAN summit, where we saw what Marco Rubio said after his meeting with Sergei Lavrov, and what Sergei Lavrov, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, what they wrote and on their official site. It seems that two different Marco Rubios talked to two different Sergei Lavrovs. The accounts were so different to what has happened, to what's been discussed, to how they spoke about different issues. So, of course, the Russian side always plays this card of everything is fine, everything's going according to plan, nothing can hurt us at all. Although we see how bad the economy is, and you don't need to be an economist, of course, to realize that, yes, things are quite bad, and economists are saying how bad things are going. The inflation is through the roof. Everyone inside Russia is seeing that. Of course, as usual in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in those central cities, the impact is not that bad. But in general, in Russia, the situation is dire. Economically, the situation is dire. So, of course, definitely Medvedev, former President Medvedev, is supposed to say that those sanctions are a mockery, it doesn't hurt us at all. And just now, Sergei Karaganov, one of the renowned political analysts of Russia, he published just today, he published a paper on how Russia is turning its back on Europe because nothing good comes from Europe, and Russia is turning to the Asia-Pacific region. So yes, Asia-Pacific is the region where Russia is so powerful and where everyone supports Russia. And just remember how Putin loves to say that European nations and the United States are not the whole world. The world is way bigger. And the biggest parts of the world, like India or Pakistan or China or Brazil, are supporting Russia. Well, support is a strong word. They are not supporting, they are working with Russia. They are getting as much as they can for their benefit from Russia. But this is the propaganda of the highest level in the Russian government. Always we've been hearing this. Nothing serious is happening. Everything's going according to plan. And the whole world, the biggest part of the world, supports Russia. So, of course, there's no doubt that this is the way they should react. Or better, I must say that we haven't seen, as of yet, we haven't seen any particular reaction of the Kremlin to weapons going to Ukraine. Exactly, because they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk. They want to talk about sanctions that are not there for 50 days. This is amazing to talk about it. Yes, let's all pay attention to those non-existent sanctions that will happen or will not happen if Trump will chicken out. Because, of course, everyone remembers that taco, Trump always chickens out. Maybe something like that would happen. Then no sanctions at all will be there in September, in the beginning of September. So this is what they want to talk about. And of course, the last thing they want to talk about are the real weapons, the real difficulty and the real obstacle that they will have in obtaining more Ukrainian territory. And that is weapons. The weaponry is what is coming to Ukraine. And so this is, of course, that's why all we will hear now are sanctions, non-existent sanctions, because that's such a pleasure to talk about it right now, because only on September 2nd, if something happens, those sanctions will take effect only September 2nd.
You mentioned India, China, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has called on representatives of China, India, and Brazil to contact Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and urge him to agree to ceasefire, warning that failure to do so could expose them to secondary sanctions. And speaking in an interview with Fox News, Rutte stated, if you are in Beijing, Delhi, or Brazil and understand that this affects you, you should call Vladimir Putin and say, hey, we're still buying goods from you, but you need to take negotiations on a ceasefire or a peace agreement seriously. Otherwise, we will end up facing secondary sanctions. What concrete mechanisms exist for China, India, and Brazil to effectively influence Vladimir Putin's decisions on a ceasefire, given their current political and economic ties with Moscow?
And this, just one note before answering the question, Mark Rutte talked about sanctions quite a lot with Fox News, and in general, he talked about it quite a lot, while Mark Rutte is the head of NATO, the head of NATO that is receiving weapons for Ukraine and that will ship weapons to Ukraine. So we see how it is interconnected, how sanctions and weapons are actually interconnected. And it's not by mistake that it all happens at the same time. Yes, we are not seeing the full pressure from the American side, but it's all interconnected 100%. So coming to the question, how could they push Russia? How could they insist? Of course, the Russian president will now say that Russia can withstand, can resist the sanctions because otherwise they need to agree to the American terms. And they will try to convince convince China and try to convince India to help Russia more and to buy more from Russia. And as we understand, the sanctions will take effect, if they take effect on September 2nd, if there's no ceasefire before that, if there are no talks before that, they will take effect on September 2nd. And what is September 2nd? At that point, Putin will be in China. He is set to visit China from August 31st to September 3rd. So this will be the moment when sanctions on China will take effect if Russia does not come to negotiation table and there is no ceasefire, at least ceasefire. Although now what we're hearing from Mark Rutte is peace deal, not just ceasefire, not just permanent ceasefire without the ending, like a 30-day ceasefire. No. Not the United States are not talking about ceasefire for a certain period of time. They either talking about indefinite ceasefire, but now Mark Rutte is talking about a peace deal, not just ceasefire. So if sanctions do take effect, they will take effect while Putin will be in China. So there is an idea, there is this view on those 50 days. Why 50? Why not 60 like with Iran? Because first of all, Trump is more powerful with Russia. He pressures Russia even more than Iran. And we all remember what happened with Iran, again, coming to that point. But so those 50 days, why 50, not 30, not 60? Why 50? Because Putin will be in China. There is a way to look at it and from that standpoint. So the Chinese leader can pressure Putin, also. He can try to convince Putin not to give in to pressure from the United States. But at the same time, neither China nor India nor Brazil, nobody would want to take on unnecessary commitments, because without those commitments, they cannot extend help to Russia. Russia cannot resist the sanctions without their commitments, without their help. So they understand that they might want, and the Chinese leader might want Putin not to give in to pressure from the United States, from the European nations, but they cannot take on themselves the commitments to help Russia. So that is why, again, also China and India, they all understand that in order to prevent Russia from accidentally breaking through Ukrainian defenses, Donald Trump is sending weapons. Donald Trump is sending weapons to Kyiv exactly because he doesn't want Russia to break through Ukrainian defense. And on the other hand, no, he wants Ukraine to go on offense. This is what Trump is counting on. So he also gives those 50 days also to India and to China to realize the situation, to realize that there will never be more pro-Russian proposals, as President Trump has said. Everyone is a loser, as President Trump has said. This proposal is as fair as it can be, if there can be a fair proposal. There will be no winners, as President Trump has said. There will be only losers. Everyone is losing. So there will not be more pro-Russian, let's say, proposals. Therefore, India and China would either need to take upon themselves serious financial commitments or see Russia give in to pressure. So for now, of course, they will all realize the situation. They will all think about some ideas how to avoid those sanctions, most probably, talking about some gray imports, let's say. But most probably this will be extremely difficult, especially in these circumstances. And so now Delhi and Beijing, they would just frankly talk to Russia, and this is the only way they can actually discuss this situation. Frank discussion of the situation and realization that there is no way. They either take commitment, financial, extremely difficult financial commitment upon themselves, India and China and Brazil, they will take commitment upon themselves to support Russia and to support Putin, or they would need to say that, yes, he needs to give in to that pressure. Yes, he needs to come to the negotiation table, because they would not want to pay for Russia. They would not want to pay for Russian oil and pay in a broad sense of the word. I mean, pay by not having their products go to the United States, by not have their products go to the American market. That's what they actually need, and that's where they get their profit from. So that those commitments cannot be taken by China and by India. So only by discussing the situation, how would it be after those 50 days, this will already be the pressure from China and from India.
Alexandra, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has gained an unexpected ally in the White House. It is not the US President himself who this week approved the delivery of Patriot missile systems, but his wife, Melania Trump, according to the Times. It has become known that the First Lady, who was born in the former Yugoslavia, regularly reminds her husband of the victims of Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian cities. On Monday, during a conversation in the Oval Office, Donald Trump said, "I go home, I tell the First Lady, you know, I spoke to Vladimir Putin today, we had a wonderful conversation." She said, "Oh, really? Another city was just hit." What influence, if any, does the First Lady have on President Trump's foreign policy decisions, particularly concerning Ukraine and the war with Russia, in your opinion?
It's great that you took note of that. It is great because actually we haven't seen Melania Trump in those conversations in any capacity. This is the first time when we see this turnaround by President Trump, turnaround giving weapons to Ukraine, turnaround in supporting let's not say that Donald Trump is turning to Ukraine. Let's say that Donald Trump is turning his back on Russia. Donald Trump is turning his back on Putin. And this is the first time when this happens, this is the first time when we hear Melania Trump's name in this context. And that is very important. That is very important because Melania Trump, she doesn't come up in many speeches by Donald Trump, apart from him saying that he has a wonderful wife, she's amazing and great. Nothing about policy. She's not there when we are talking about US policies especially regarding foreign affairs. But in general, she's not there. And even in her book, she contradicted some of the policies of President Trump because she talked about abortion. And from her book, we can make conclusions that she's pro-choice, unlike most voters of Donald Trump who are pro-life or they are anti-abortion voters. So from her book, we see that she's pro-life. So she doesn't talk about policy a lot. Of course, when floods in Texas happen, when people are killed, she's traveling there with President Trump, and she is trying to somehow soothe the pain of victims of those people who lost their loved ones. She's doing that, but that's social work, psychological work, support, but nothing about policy. She doesn't talk about policy. And here, all of a sudden, Melania Trump appears to be that, let's say, cardinal who is a half step back after President Trump, and who is actually forming the policy in a way, at least influencing the policy, who can influence Donald Trump in his cabinet? Not many people, but most probably Melania Trump can. And she's one of those people who are not seen in this capacity at all, not seen. And Donald Trump talked about her twice while discussing Ukraine. He talked about it with Mark Rutte, and a few hours after that, in the prayer breakfast in the White House, in prayer lunch, in the White House, he talked about her again. And he started explaining why he changed its policy from talking about Melania Trump and the way she sees what is happening in Ukraine and how Russia is bombarding Ukraine and peaceful Ukrainian cities. So this is very interesting that you took note of it, and I think this is actually significant because in no other policy decisions, or especially policy turnarounds, that's what we've seen yesterday, we've never heard of Melania Trump influencing Donald Trump in any way. And here, most probably, we are seeing and we are hearing about her actual influence on Donald Trump's policy.
While President Trump talks in deadlines, Melania speaks in reality, reminding the world that behind every wonderful conversation with Putin, another Ukrainian city is burning. Alexandra, thank you so much for this interesting and important conversation. I need to say that Alexandra Filippenko, political analyst, European Leadership Network UK member, was with us today. And thank you so much to our audience for attention, for your likes and your comments. See you.
Thank you very much.